Here I am sitting in my office Monday morning watching my replacement, Brandon, fumble through his first day as operations director while I prepare for the most satisfying meeting of my career. Just last week, CFO David smugly announced Brandon's promotion mere hours after CEO William's funeral, dismissing my 12 years of unwavering dedication with a wave of his hand. What David doesn't know is that I've quietly activated a buyback clause worth $3.2 million, dollars, triggered specifically by termination without cause. Today, I'll reveal that this company now belongs to me, transforming their corporate arrogance into my ultimate victory over nepotism and betrayal. My name is Harper, and 12 years ago I walked into Meridian Industries as a fresh-faced junior analyst with nothing but determination and a business degree from Colorado State. This mid-sized manufacturing company in Denver became my second home, my proving ground, my entire professional identity. I climbed every rung of that corporate ladder through pure grit, working late nights and weekends, mastering every system, every process, every intricate detail of our operations. William A. Patterson, our CEO, became more than just my boss. He was my mentor, my champion, the father figure who saw potential in me when others saw just another ambitious young woman. During our monthly one-on-one meetings in his corner office, overlooking the Rocky Mountains, William would lean back in his leather chair and share his vision for the company's future. More importantly, he consistently promised me the operations director position once I completed my MBA, which I finished last spring while maintaining my full-time responsibilities. The funeral last Tuesday felt like watching my dreams get buried alongside William's casket. St. Joseph Cathedral was packed with employees, clients, and industry leaders all paying respects to a man who built Meridian from a struggling startup into a $15 million enterprise. I sat in the third pew clutching my black purse, tears streaming down my cheeks as the pastor spoke about William's integrity and vision. But my grief turned to shock when David Hartwell, our CFO, approached me in the parking lot while dirt was literally still being shoveled onto William's grave. David, a thin man in his 50s with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, pulled me aside near his black Mercedes. "Harper, I need to discuss some immediate organizational changes," he said, his voice carrying an odd mixture of formality and excitement. My heart pounded as I anticipated the conversation I'd been preparing for all year. Finally, my promotion would be official. Instead, David delivered a crushing blow. "We've decided to promote Brandon to operations director effective immediately. He's been with us for 8 months now, and frankly, he already handles more responsibilities than you do. He deserves this opportunity." Brandon, David's 26-year-old nephew who arrived straight from business school with zero real-world experience, armed only with theoretical knowledge and family connections. The same Brandon who needed constant guidance on basic inventory management, who confused our supplier contracts, who had never managed a team larger than his college study group. "I don't understand," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the cemetery's rustling trees. "William promised me this position. We discussed the transition timeline just 3 weeks ago." David shrugged, adjusting his glasses with callous indifference. "William made many promises he couldn't keep. The board agrees that Brandon brings fresh energy and innovative thinking to the role. You'll continue as senior operations analyst, of course. We value your experience." Value my experience. 12 years of dedication reduced to a consolation prize. That evening, I sat in my downtown apartment staring at the contract renewal I'd signed just 2 months earlier. William had insisted on updating my employment terms, explaining that he wanted to ensure my security during the company's growth phase. I remembered his unusual emphasis on certain clauses, particularly one labeled ownership protection provision, that seemed overly complex for a standard employment agreement. Friday morning, I started cleaning out my old office to make room for Brandon's immediate occupancy. As I packed my awards and personal items into cardboard boxes, I discovered several quarterly financial reports that had somehow gotten mixed in with my files. These weren't documents I should have had access to, and as I glanced through them, inconsistencies jumped out immediately. Vendor payments to companies I'd never heard of, consulting fees for services that didn't align with any projects I knew about, equipment purchases that never appeared in our inventory systems. The numbers didn't add up, and my analytical mind couldn't ignore the patterns suggesting systematic financial irregularities. When I mentioned these discrepancies to David Monday morning, his reaction was telling. His face went pale, his hands trembled slightly as he grabbed the reports from my desk, and he stammered explanations about accounting reclassifications and year-end adjustments that made no logical sense. That's when everything clicked into place. David didn't promote Brandon because of his qualifications. He promoted Brandon because he needed me gone, needed my analytical skills and institutional knowledge removed from the equation before someone discovered whatever financial games he'd been playing. But David made one critical mistake. He fired me without cause, which triggered that mysterious ownership protection provision William had so carefully built into my contract. Sunday evening, I finally understood what William had been protecting me from, and I scheduled an emergency meeting with Morrison Blake and Associates for Tuesday morning. Monday was going to be very interesting indeed. Monday morning arrived with Denver's typical autumn crispness, and I walked into Meridian's offices with a smile that probably confused my former colleagues. Instead of the broken, defeated woman they expected to see, I radiated calm confidence as I settled into the temporary desk David had assigned me in the general administrative area. Brandon stood in my former office, looking like a deer caught in headlights, as he stared at the computer screens displaying the operations dashboard I had designed over 3 years of careful refinement. The system tracked everything from material inventory to shipping schedules, supplier performance metrics to quality control checkpoints. It was my masterpiece, and watching him try to navigate it was like watching someone attempt brain surgery with a butter knife. "Harper!" he called out, his voice carrying across the open floor plan. "Could you help me understand this inventory tracking thing? The numbers aren't making sense." I walked over with practiced patience, noting how he'd already managed to input incorrect data that would cascade through our entire supply chain if left uncorrected. Brandon was tall and lanky, with sandy brown hair and the kind of eager expression that might be endearing if it weren't attached to someone who'd stolen my career. The system calculates reorder points based on seasonal demand patterns, I explained, reaching over to fix his errors. You have to adjust the baseline parameters for Q4 manufacturing schedules, otherwise you'll overstock slower-moving items while creating shortages in high-demand products. He nodded enthusiastically, scribbling notes that demonstrated he understood perhaps 30% of what I'd just explained. "This is so complex. How did you learn all this?" 12 years of experience, I replied sweetly, building these systems from scratch, testing them, refining them based on real-world results. As the morning progressed, I watched Brandon struggle with tasks that had become second nature to me. He couldn't locate the supplier contact database. He didn't understand our quality control protocols. He was completely lost when trying to interpret our shipping logistics software. Sarah Martinez, our assistant operations manager, stopped by my temporary desk around 10:30. Sarah had been my right hand for 4 years, a sharp woman in her 30s with dark hair and an MBA from University of Denver. Her expression conveyed barely contained frustration. "This is insane, Harper," she whispered, glancing around to ensure David wasn't within earshot. "Brandon just approved a $30,000 equipment purchase without checking if we actually need it. He doesn't understand our vendor certification requirements. 3 of our longtime suppliers have already called, asking why their contact person changed without notice." I nodded sympathetically while internally celebrating Sarah's observations. Every mistake Brandon made strengthened my position for the inevitable reckoning. Around noon, Brandon approached my desk with what he clearly thought was a brilliant idea. "Harper, I've been thinking about ways to improve efficiency around here. David mentioned that you've developed some really valuable process innovations over the years, intellectual property stuff that could really boost our productivity." My pulse quickened, but I maintained my composed expression. What kind of intellectual property? You know those workflow optimization systems you created, the quality control algorithms. David said they're worth a fortune and that I should definitely implement them in my new role. Brandon's enthusiasm was almost endearing in its naivety. He mentioned something about transferring the ownership documentation to make everything official. There it was, the confirmation I needed that David's plan extended beyond simply removing me from the organization. He intended to steal the innovations I'd developed, the processes I'd patented and copyrighted through the company's intellectual property program. These weren't just internal systems, they were my creative work, legally protected and potentially worth millions in licensing agreements. That's interest, I said carefully. Did David explain the legal requirements for transferring intellectual property rights? Brandon waved dismissively. Oh, he's handling all the paperwork. Said it would be seamless since you're staying on as an analyst anyway. You're basically giving me everything I need to succeed, right? Wrong, so incredibly wrong. The afternoon brought a steady stream of operational crises that demonstrated just how unprepared Brandon was for leadership responsibility. A shipment to our largest client went to the wrong address because he misread the logistics software. A quality control inspection failed because he approved materials that didn't meet our certification standards. 2 employees came to me directly bypassing Brandon entirely because they couldn't get coherent answers to basic operational questions. With each crisis, I documented everything: timestamps, decision points, financial impacts, safety implications. My phone's voice recorder captured conversations where Brandon explicitly admitted he didn't understand critical processes. My laptop stored screenshots of his incorrect system inputs and email chains where he approved inappropriate vendor selections. By 5 o'clock, I had enough evidence to demonstrate that Brandon's promotion was not only undeserved but potentially dangerous to the company's operational integrity. More importantly, I'd confirmed David's intention to commit intellectual property theft on a scale that would constitute federal fraud charges. As I packed my briefcase that evening, Brandon stopped by my temporary desk one more time. Thanks for all your help today, Harper. I know this transition is probably difficult for you, but I really appreciate how professional you're being about everything. He paused, then added with obvious pride, David says once we get all your process documentation transferred over, I'll be running the most efficient operations department in our industry sector. I smiled warmly and gathered my belongings. I'm sure you'll get exactly what you deserve, Brandon. Tomorrow's meeting with my attorney was going to be very enlightening. Tuesday morning found me sitting across from Jennifer Walsh in the downtown offices of Morrison, Blake & Associates. Jennifer was a corporate attorney in her 40s with silver-streaked auburn hair and the kind of sharp intelligence that made opposing counsel nervous. She'd reviewed my employment contract overnight, and her expression as she spread the documents across her mahogany conference table told me everything I needed to know. Harper, I've been practicing corporate law for 18 years, and I've never seen a protection clause quite like this one. Jennifer began tapping the contract with her Mont Blanc pen. William Patterson was either incredibly prescient or deeply concerned about potential corporate governance issues at Meridian. She explained that my employment agreement contained what she termed an ownership reversion provision, disguised as standard severance language. If I were terminated without cause within 18 months of William's death, I could purchase controlling interest in Meridian Industries for 10% of its current market valuation. Given the company's $15 million assessment, that meant I could become majority owner for $1.5 million. But there was more. The provision included a financing mechanism where William's estate would provide the necessary capital through a pre-established trust fund, with repayment terms spread over 10 years at below-market interest rates. Essentially, William had created a pathway for me to own the company that required minimal upfront investment. The genius of this arrangement, Jennifer continued, is that it's triggered specifically by termination without cause, which means David can't claim you were fired for performance issues. His decision to promote Brandon instead of you, combined with your 12-year exemplary employment record, constitutes clear breach of implied contract expectations. My hands trembled as the implications sank in. William hadn't just been protecting my job security, he'd been positioning me to inherit his life's work. But Jennifer's next revelation was even more shocking. Her preliminary investigation into Meridian's financial records conducted through legal discovery channels available to terminated employees revealed systematic embezzlement spanning at least 2 years. David has been creating false vendor accounts and approving payments to companies that exist only on paper, she explained, spreading bank statements and invoices across the table. We're talking about approximately $200,000 in fraudulent transactions, all carefully structured to avoid triggering automatic audit alerts. The evidence was overwhelming. Consulting payments to non-existent firms, equipment purchases for items never delivered, service contracts for maintenance work never performed. David had been systematically draining company resources while William was distracted by health issues and strategic planning initiatives. But here's where it gets really interesting, Jennifer said, opening another file folder. Yesterday afternoon, I discovered that David has already begun forging documents to transfer your intellectual property rights. He's filed preliminary paperwork with the State Commerce Department, claiming that your process innovations were developed as work for hire under Brandon's supervision. The forgery was brazen and clumsy. David had backdated Brandon's employment to suggest he'd been involved in developing systems that predated his arrival by several years. He'd created false project timelines showing Brandon as the lead developer on innovations that existed long before he joined the company. This moves us from civil fraud into federal criminal territory, Jennifer explained grimly. Intellectual property theft, document forgery, wire fraud, embezzlement. David is looking at serious prison time if we can prove intentional deception. But the timeline was critical. David was rushing to complete a merger with Pacific Northwest Manufacturing, a deal scheduled to finalize Friday afternoon. The merger would value Meridian at $18 million and provide David with enough liquidity to cover his theft while diluting my ownership rights to insignificance. We have 48 hours to activate your buyback clause, Jennifer warned. After that, the merger terms override your contract provisions and David walks away wealthy while you lose everything. As Tuesday afternoon dissolved into evening, Jennifer outlined our strategy. We would file the ownership transfer documents Wednesday morning while simultaneously submitting evidence of David's crimes to federal authorities. The merger company Pacific Northwest Manufacturing would be notified of the pending ownership change and the criminal investigation. There's one more thing, Jennifer said as we prepared to leave the conference room. My investigation suggests that William's death might not have been coincidental timing. His cardiologist confirmed that his heart attack was triggered by extreme stress, and his administrative assistant mentioned that he'd been working late nights reviewing financial records in the weeks before he died. The implication hit me like physical blow. William might have discovered David's embezzlement and confronted him shortly before the fatal cardiac episode. David's rush to promote Brandon and remove me from the organization suddenly made horrifying sense. He wasn't just stealing money, he was covering up potential murder. Wednesday was going to determine whether justice would finally be served. Wednesday morning began with me making a series of strategic client calls from my home office, ostensibly to reassure our major accounts about the recent organizational changes. In reality, I was documenting their concerns about Brandon's competence while building support for the leadership transition that would occur within 24 hours. Richard Chen from Automotive Solutions Express was particularly blunt. Harper, I've been working with Meridian for 8 years, and frankly, your new operations director seems completely lost. Yesterday, he couldn't answer basic questions about our delivery schedule requirements. If you're not involved in managing our account going forward, we'll need to reconsider our partnership. Similar conversations with Industrial Components Inc. and Mountain States, Manufacturing, and Peak Performance Logistics revealed a pattern of client dissatisfaction that would devastate Meridian's revenue within weeks. Brandon's inexperience wasn't just embarrassing, it was actively destroying relationships that took years to build. Meanwhile, Brandon's catastrophic management continued at the office. According to Sarah's text updates, he'd approved raw material purchases without checking current inventory levels, creating $50,000 in unnecessary costs. He'd scheduled equipment maintenance during peak production hours, forcing a complete manufacturing shutdown. Most critically, he'd misunderstood a quality control specification for our largest client, potentially creating liability issues worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. David's desperation became increasingly obvious as the day progressed. He called my personal cell phone at 11:45, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Harper, I need you to come in this afternoon to sign some transition documentation. It's just paperwork to formalize your new role as senior analyst and transfer some of your old project files to Brandon." I agreed sweetly to meet him at 3 o'clock, knowing that these transition documents were actually intellectual property transfer agreements that would legitimize David's theft. What David didn't know was that Jennifer would be recording our conversation from the adjacent conference room. At 2:30, my phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed Pacific Northwest Manufacturing. I answered cautiously, expecting another client concern call. Instead, I heard the crisp, professional voice of Patricia Moore, CEO of Pacific Northwest Manufacturing. "Miss Harper, this is Patricia Moore. I hope I'm not interrupting your day, but I was wondering if we could have a confidential conversation about the Meridian Industries merger." My pulse quickened. "Of course, Miss Moore. What can I help you with?" "Please call me Patricia. I'll be direct because time seems to be a factor here. Our due diligence investigation has revealed some significant irregularities in Meridian's financial reporting, specifically involving CFO David Hartwell. We've been monitoring these issues for several weeks, and frankly, we're questioning whether to proceed with the acquisition." The conversation that followed was extraordinary. Patricia explained that Pacific Northwest had been conducting covert financial surveillance of Meridian for months, uncovering the same embezzlement patterns that Jennifer had discovered. But their investigation went deeper, revealing connections to organized fraud schemes involving multiple companies across the region. "We've been cooperating with federal investigators," Patricia continued. "The FBI's white-collar crime division has been building a case against David and his associates. What we didn't expect was to discover that Meridian's most valuable operational assets are actually the intellectual property of a single employee who's been systematically marginalized by the very person we're investigating." Patricia knew about my process innovations, my operational systems, my 12 years of building Meridian's efficiency infrastructure. More shocking still, she knew about the ownership reversion clause and was calling to offer her support. "Harper, if you activate that buyback provision, Pacific Northwest would be very interested in discussing a partnership rather than an acquisition. We believe you're the future of Meridian Industries, not David Hartwell or his nephew." She offered terms that made my head spin. A merger that would value the combined companies at $35 million, with me maintaining controlling interest and serving as Chief Operations Officer for the entire organization. My annual compensation would more than double, and I'd have equity participation in Pacific Northwest's expansion plans across the western United States. "There's just one catch," Patricia added. "We need David removed from the organization completely. His criminal behavior has exposed both companies to regulatory sanctions and civil liability. Are you prepared to take action that will likely result in his arrest and prosecution?" I thought about William's death, about 12 years of dedication, dismissed with casual cruelty, about Brandon's unearned promotion, and David's attempted theft of my life's work. "Yes," I replied firmly. "I'm absolutely prepared to do what's necessary." Patricia's satisfaction was audible through the phone. "Excellent. My legal team will coordinate with your attorney to ensure the ownership transfer proceeds smoothly. By Friday afternoon, you'll be in control of Meridian Industries, and David Hartwell will be in federal custody." As I hung up the phone, I realized that David's corruption had actually created the opportunity for my ultimate professional triumph. His greed and desperation had brought together the evidence, the legal framework, and the strategic partnerships necessary to transform his intended betrayal into my greatest victory. The 3 o'clock meeting with David was going to be very interesting indeed. Thursday morning brought Denver's first snowfall of the season, coating the city in pristine white that somehow felt prophetic as I prepared for the most important day of my career. Jennifer had filed the ownership transfer documents at 8 o'clock sharp, and by 9:15, David's attorney was calling in a panic, demanding an emergency board meeting. I arrived at Meridian's offices to find chaos already unfolding. David stood in the reception area, arguing frantically with board members who'd been summoned for an emergency session, his usually pristine appearance disheveled and desperate. His silver hair was uncombed, his tie crooked, his wire-rimmed glasses sliding down his nose as he gestured wildly. "This is absolutely preposterous," he shouted at board chairman Robert Stevens, a distinguished man in his 60s who'd been William's closest friend and business partner. "Harper is trying to steal the company through some ridiculous legal technicality. She doesn't have the capital for an ownership transfer, and even if she did, the merger with Pacific Northwest takes precedence over any employment contract provisions." Robert's expression remained stoically calm as he reviewed the documents Jennifer had provided. As William's closest confidant, he'd apparently known about the ownership protection clause all along. His steady gaze moved from David's panicked face to mine, and I saw approval in his eyes. Actually, David William discussed this provision with me when he added it to Harper's contract. He specifically wanted protection mechanisms in place if anything happened to him. Robert's voice carried quiet authority. "The legal documentation appears to be entirely legitimate." While the board members huddled in heated discussion, I noticed Brandon hovering near the operations office, his face pale with dawning comprehension. Something had clearly shaken him, and as I approached, he grabbed my arm with desperate urgency. "Harper, I need to talk to you privately, right now. Something terrible is happening, and I think I'm in serious trouble." We stepped into the empty conference room, and Brandon's composure completely collapsed. His hands shook as he pulled documents from a manila folder, his voice breaking with fear and confusion. "I found these in David's desk drawer this morning," he whispered, spreading forged intellectual property transfer agreements across the conference table. "My signature is on documents I never signed. There are contracts showing me as lead developer on systems that existed before I even worked here. Harper, someone forged my name on federal patent applications." The terror in his voice was genuine. Brandon had stumbled across evidence of his uncle's crimes and realized he'd been positioned as an unwitting accomplice in federal fraud charges. Document forgery, intellectual property theft, false statements to government agencies, all bearing his forged signature as apparent authorization. "David told me these were standard transition documents," Brandon continued, his voice barely audible. "He said I needed to sign them to officially take over your responsibilities. I trusted him. I thought this was normal corporate procedure." My anger toward Brandon began dissolving into something approaching sympathy. He was still an unqualified nepotism hire who'd taken my job, but he was also a naive young man who'd been manipulated into criminal activity by someone he trusted. "Brandon, you need to understand that your uncle has been embezzling money from this company for at least 2 years, I said gently. "He promoted you and removed me because I discovered financial irregularities that could expose his theft. The forged documents are his attempt to steal intellectual property worth millions of dollars." Brandon's face went white. "Oh God, the FBI is going to think I'm part of this, aren't they? I could go to prison for crimes I didn't even know I was committing." That's when I made a decision that surprised even me. Despite everything Brandon had cost me, despite the humiliation and betrayal, I found myself offering him a lifeline. "There might be a way to protect you," I said quietly. "If you're willing to cooperate fully with the federal investigation and testify truthfully about David's deception, I can recommend immunity consideration. But you have to be completely honest about everything you know." Brandon nodded frantically, tears streaming down his face. I'll do anything. I never wanted to hurt anyone. I just thought David was giving me an opportunity to prove myself. At that moment, the conference room door burst open, and David stormed in with wild desperation in his eyes. What are you two discussing, Brandon? You need to stay focused on your responsibilities instead of listening to Harper's manipulations. Behind David, I saw Jennifer entering with two serious-looking men in dark suits. Federal investigators here to place David under arrest. Actually, David Brandon and I were discussing his cooperation with the federal investigation into your embezzlement and fraud schemes, I said calmly, standing to face the man who tried to destroy my career. David's face went through a range of emotions: shock, rage, calculation, and finally, desperate defiance. You have no proof of any wrongdoing. This is all Harper's revenge fantasy because she couldn't handle being passed over for promotion. Jennifer stepped forward with a briefcase full of evidence. Mr. Hartwell, we have bank records showing $200,000 in fraudulent vendor payments. We have forged documents bearing your nephew's signature on intellectual property theft. We have recorded conversations where you admit to manipulating personnel decisions to cover financial irregularities. The federal agents moved closer, and David's bravado finally cracked. This is all a misunderstanding. Harper is trying to steal the company through some legal loophole. She's been planning this corporate coup for months. Robert Stevens, who'd been listening from the doorway, stepped forward with quiet dignity. David William Patterson was my closest friend for 30 years. He specifically told me that if anything happened to him, Harper should inherit control of this company. He trusted her integrity and feared that others might not. As the handcuffs clicked around David's wrists, he made one final desperate attempt to salvage his reputation. You'll regret this, Harper. I built this company alongside William. You're just an employee who got lucky with a contract technicality. I watched David being led away in federal custody, feeling not triumph, but rather profound sadness for the waste of human potential. He'd had everything: a successful career, family relationships, financial security. His greed and ego had destroyed it all. Brandon stood beside me, still trembling but resolute in his decision to cooperate with justice. Sarah appeared in the doorway with other employees who'd gathered to witness the extraordinary events unfolding in their workplace. The company was mine now, and it was time to start rebuilding. Friday morning arrived with brilliant sunshine streaming through my new office windows as I sat behind William's mahogany desk, officially installed as Chief Executive Officer of Meridian Industries. The federal investigators had worked through the night processing David's arrest and securing evidence, while Jennifer finalized the ownership transfer that made me majority shareholder of the company I'd helped build for 12 years. But the most shocking revelation came from William's estate attorney, Charles Morrison, who arrived at 9 o'clock with documents that fundamentally changed everything I thought I knew about my situation. Harper, there's something else William wanted you to have, Charles said, opening a sealed envelope that bore my name in William's distinctive handwriting. This trust document has been sealed since his death, waiting for the specific circumstances we witnessed yesterday. Inside was a trust agreement establishing that William had secretly purchased an additional 25% of Meridian's shares over the past 3 years, holding them in a protected trust that would transfer to me upon his death if I ever faced termination without cause. Combined with the ownership reversion clause, this made me the outright majority owner with 65% control. William knew David was stealing, Charles explained, settling into the leather chair across from my desk. He'd been building this protection structure for months, gathering evidence while positioning you to take over if anything happened to him. His heart attack occurred the night after he confronted David about the embezzlement. The emotional weight of William's faith in me brought tears to my eyes. He'd literally risked his life to protect the company's future, trusting that I would carry forward his vision of ethical leadership and operational excellence. The merger with Pacific Northwest Manufacturing proceeded as planned, but under dramatically different terms. Instead of David receiving $18 million for selling a company he'd been systematically looting, I negotiated a partnership that valued the combined organization at $38 million while maintaining operational independence for Meridian's Denver facility. Patricia Moore arrived that afternoon with her leadership team, and we spent 3 hours developing integration plans that would leverage both companies' strengths while preserving the culture William had built. My annual compensation package increased to $250,000 plus equities participation that could be worth millions as the combined company expanded. But money wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was the opportunity to create the kind of workplace I'd always envisioned: merit-based promotions, innovative thinking rewarded ethical leadership modeled from the top down. My first major decision involved Brandon, who'd spent the morning meeting with federal prosecutors to provide testimony about David's manipulation. Despite his initial unearned promotion, Brandon had shown genuine remorse and complete cooperation with the investigation. More importantly, he had demonstrated teachable humility that suggested real potential for growth. Brandon, I am offering you the position of Assistant Operations Manager under Sarah's supervision, I announced during our afternoon meeting. The salary will be $45,000, which reflects your current experience level. If you're willing to learn properly and prove yourself through performance rather than connections, there will be advancement opportunities. Brandon's relief was palpable. Thank you, Harper. I know I don't deserve this chance, but I promise I'll earn your trust. I want to learn how to do this job the right way. Sarah's promotion to operations director was long overdue recognition for her competence and loyalty. At 32, she'd proven herself capable of managing complex projects while maintaining the detailed focus necessary for manufacturing excellence. Her salary increased to $90,000, and she would lead the integration of our systems with Pacific Northwest's operations. Sarah, you've earned this through 4 years of exceptional performance, I told her as she reviewed her new job description. I need someone I can trust completely to manage day-to-day operations while I focus on strategic growth. The transformation in workplace culture was immediate and dramatic. Employees who'd been demoralized by David's nepotism and Brandon's incompetence suddenly found themselves in an environment where expertise mattered more than politics. Production efficiency increased by 12% in the first week as workers regained confidence in leadership decisions. Client relationships that Brandon had damaged were rapidly restored through personal calls, where I assured each account manager that competent leadership had returned. Richard from Automotive Solutions Express was particularly enthusiastic about our renewed partnership, committing to a 2-year contract extension worth $800,000. The media attention was both unexpected and gratifying. Business Journal Colorado ran a cover story titled, "Corporate Corruption: Exposed Employee Becomes Owner Through Legal Protection Clause." The article highlighted how Williams' foresight had protected shareholder interests while demonstrating the importance of ethical leadership succession planning. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from our employees themselves. A group led by Sarah presented me with a plaque reading, "Leadership Through Integrity," signed by every person in the company. Their trust and respect meant more than any financial reward or media coverage. 6 months later, Meridian Industries had become the regional success story that William always envisioned. Revenue had increased by 35% through improved operational efficiency and restored client confidence. Our workforce had expanded from 42 to 68 employees, all hired based on merit rather than connections. David was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison and ordered to pay full restitution to both the company and affected employees. His assets were seized to cover the embezzled funds, ensuring that his crimes didn't permanently damage the organization he'd tried to destroy. Brandon had transformed into a competent manager who understood that success required hard work and continuous learning. His relationship with his uncle's criminal behavior remained a source of personal shame, but he channeled that regret into becoming the kind of employee who earned advancement through performance. Most importantly, we'd created systems that would prevent future abuse. board oversight mechanisms, financial auditing protocols, intellectual property, protection procedures, and transparent promotion criteria that valued merit above personal relationships. Standing in William's office as Autumn returned to Denver, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought me to this moment. What began as the worst betrayal of my career had become the opportunity to fulfill my highest professional aspirations. 1 year after that devastating funeral where my career seemed to end, I stood once again in St. Joseph Cathedral, this time for a memorial service celebrating William Patterson's vision and the company he'd built. The sanctuary was filled with employees, clients, and industry leaders who'd watched Meridian Industries transform from a corruption-damaged organization into a model of ethical business leadership. As I approached the podium to deliver the keynote address, I carried with me a letter William had left specifically for this occasion, sealed until the anniversary of his death and opened only that morning. His words still brought tears to my eyes as I shared them with the gathered assembly. Harper. His letter read, "If you're reading this, it means you've successfully navigated the challenges I anticipated and taken control of the company we built together. I knew David's greed would eventually threaten everything we'd worked for, and I trusted your integrity to preserve our mission of treating employees with dignity while delivering excellence to our clients. You were always the daughter I never had and the leader I always hoped you'd become." The memorial service concluded with the announcement of the William Patterson Foundation for Ethical Leadership, funded through Meridian's charitable giving program and dedicated to supporting employee protection initiatives across Colorado's business community. We would never allow another David Hartwell to destroy lives through corporate corruption. That afternoon, I drove to Riverside Cemetery and knelt beside William's grave, now marked with a beautiful granite monument funded by employee contributions. The autumn leaves created a golden carpet around the headstone, and the Rocky Mountains provided a majestic backdrop for my private conversation with the man who'd shaped my destiny. "Thank you," I whispered, placing a bouquet of white roses on the grave. "Thank you for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself. Thank you for protecting me from forces I didn't even know were threatening my future. Thank you for teaching me that integrity isn't just about doing the right thing when people are watching. It's about building systems that protect others long after you're gone." The wind rustled through the cemetery trees as if William were offering his approval for the choices I'd made and the future I was building. Brandon approached quietly, having driven separately to pay his own respects to the man whose death had ultimately saved him from a life of unearned privilege. Over the past year, Brandon had become not just a competent employee, but a genuine friend, someone whose transformation reminded me daily that people can grow beyond their mistakes when given proper guidance and genuine opportunities. I never got to thank him properly for giving me a real chance to prove myself, Brandon said softly, kneeling beside me near the grave. "If he hadn't included those protection clauses in your contract, I would have continued failing upward until I destroyed my own integrity completely." Sarah joined us minutes later, along with a dozen other Meridian employees who'd come to honor William's memory and celebrate the company culture he'd established. We stood together in comfortable silence, united by shared appreciation for a leader who'd taught us that business success without ethical foundation is ultimately worthless. As the sun began setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant orange and purple hues, I reflected on the profound life lesson this entire experience had taught me. Sometimes what appears to be devastating betrayal is actually the universe's way of redirecting us toward our true destiny. David's cruelty and Brandon's unearned promotion had felt like the end of my dreams, but they were actually the catalyst for achieving something far greater than I'd ever imagined possible. The pain of that moment when David dismissed my 12 years of dedication in a cemetery parking lot had been real and crushing. But that pain had also been temporary, while the growth it forced me to embrace had become permanent. I'd learned to fight for my worth instead of hoping others would recognize it. I discovered strength I didn't know I possessed and developed leadership skills that extended far beyond operational management. Most importantly, I'd learned that true success isn't about reaching the destination you originally planned, it's about having the courage to embrace unexpected opportunities when they arise, disguised as obstacles. Williams' protection mechanisms hadn't just saved my career, they'd launched me toward a future I'd never dared imagine. Building Meridian into the ethical, employee-centered organization we'd become required confronting uncomfortable truths about corporate corruption while maintaining faith that justice eventually prevails. It required extending grace to people like Brandon, who'd made mistakes without malicious intent, while holding accountable those like David, who had deliberately chosen to harm others. The foundation we'd established would ensure that other employees facing similar challenges would have resources and legal support to protect themselves from corporate abuse. No one should have to choose between their livelihood and their principles, and no David Hartwell should be able to destroy lives through unchecked greed and nepotism. As we prepared to leave the cemetery, I took one final look at William's grave and made a silent promise to continue honoring his memory through ethical leadership that prioritized people over profits, while still achieving sustainable business growth. The drive back to Denver felt symbolic of the journey I'd completed over the past year. The road ahead was clear and bright with possibility, while the rear-view mirror reflected challenges that had ultimately strengthened rather than defeated me. That evening, I sat in my home office, preparing for Monday's board meeting, where we would announce Meridian's expansion into sustainable manufacturing practices, another initiative that reflected Williams' forward-thinking vision while addressing current market demands for environmentally responsible business operations. The company he'd entrusted to my care was thriving beyond his highest expectations, employing 78 people who came to work each day knowing their contributions mattered and their advancement depended on merit rather than politics. We'd proven that businesses could be profitable while treating employees with dignity, clients with respect, and communities with responsibility. Looking back on that terrible Tuesday when David announced Brandon's promotion, while William's grave was still fresh, I realized that moment of apparent defeat had actually been the beginning of my greatest victory. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to us contains the seeds of the best thing that could possibly happen if we have the courage to plant those seeds and nurture their growth. The pain had been real, but it had also been purposeful. The betrayal had been devastating, but it had also been revealing. The injustice had been infuriating, but it had also been instructive. Every emotion I'd experienced during that dark period had contributed to the wisdom and strength I now brought to leadership responsibilities I might never have achieved through conventional advancement paths. William's final gift hadn't just been financial protection or legal leverage. His final gift had been the opportunity to discover who I truly was when everything I thought I wanted was stripped away. In that moment of apparent loss, I'd found not just professional success, but personal fulfillment that came from building something meaningful rather than simply climbing someone else's ladder. As I prepared for sleep that anniversary evening, I felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this point. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but I would face them with confidence born from surviving the worst betrayal of my life and transforming it into the foundation for my greatest triumph. The girl who'd walked into Meridian 12 years ago as a junior analyst could never have imagined becoming the CEO who would lead the company into its most successful and ethical era. But that transformation had been possible only because I'd been forced to fight for my worth, instead of accepting others' limited vision of my potential. Sometimes the greatest gift life gives us is the opportunity to prove ourselves when everyone else has counted us out. My story had become proof that integrity ultimately triumphs over corruption, that merit eventually defeats nepotism, and that the universe has a way of ensuring justice prevails for those who refuse to compromise their principles, even when doing so would be easier. Have you ever experienced a moment when apparent betrayal actually redirected you towards something better than you'd originally planned? I'd love to hear about your own experiences with overcoming workplace injustice or discovering strength you didn't know you possessed. Your stories inspire others who might be facing similar challenges right now. Please take a moment to like this story if it resonated with your own experiences and share it with anyone who might need encouragement to fight for their worth in difficult workplace situations. Subscribe to hear more stories about ordinary people who found extraordinary courage when life demanded their best efforts. Thank you for joining me on this journey of transformation and justice. May you always remember that your worth isn't determined by others' recognition, and that sometimes the worst betrayals become the catalyst for your greatest victories. Keep fighting for what you deserve, because the universe rewards those who refuse to settle for less than their true potential.